Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us in our third TOD session. I know a lot of you have participated in the previous sessions, and if not able to see them live, you've looked at the recording, and I think we just talked about it before this call. The excitement around TOD continues to grow. I just want to thank our partners, the City of Cleveland, City of Fairview Park, and the City of Shaker Heights. They have been tremendous partners throughout this. We are doing this in partnership with GCRTA and really taking a look at how can we proactively prepare our communities for transit-oriented development and looking specifically at the zoning. We know this is something that doesn't work everywhere, but when we did our first session, we did a poll and 100% of the people participating wanted to learn more. And so we thought these are valuable ways to get together, share information from our colleagues in other states and the work that they're doing. And I really am just thrilled with the collaboration that's been happening with all of our partners. And I want to say thank you to GCRTA for partnering with us on this effort and everybody that's been involved so far. So I think we're in for a good treat with Shannon today and learning more about what Indianapolis is doing. As we always say, we're stronger together and we can learn from each other. So not just in Northeast Ohio or Ohio, but looking to other states and seeing what successes they've had and what challenges they've had. And I do believe that, through this process, we are going to effectively change policy going forward and how we develop our communities. And I think it's really, really important to have the education piece first to understand what it is, what it's not, and what we want it to be in our communities. So with that, I will turn it over to Patrick. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, Mary. Just a couple housekeeping items from folks. Again, please remain muted until Q&A, although Shannon might ask people if they have questions throughout, but we will go ahead and reserve some time at the end for conversation. If you do want to ask a question or make a comment, please click the reaction button and raise hand, and then we will give you a call. As Mary mentioned, we do have a project team that we wanted to mention and thank. A bunch of folks from the County Planning Commission, as well as Mary Beth, Mandy, and Joey from the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, who have been fantastic partners throughout, as well as our friends and partners at the City of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, and Fairview Park, who have been meeting on a regular basis to make sure that this fits their needs. When we talk about TOD, what we're describing is transit-oriented development, which includes a mix of commercial, residential, office, and entertainment centered around or located near a transit station. Dense, walkable, mixed-use development near transit attracts people and adds to vibrant, connected communities. That's the definition that comes from the Federal Transit Administration. We know that here in our own backyard. This is Intro in Cleveland in Ohio City at the corner of West 25th and Lorraine. A good example of TOD that includes proximity to transit, a mix of uses, appropriate density. It's close to the street and it has limited parking, in this case, underground. Our project goal is to improve zoning regulations and governmental policies in order to attract more TOD like this to key corridors in Cuyahoga County. And as we've done some of our research, we've recognized things that are missing include corridor land use strategies, coordinated zoning, and an incentive strategy. The TOD zoning study that we've outlined has 4 phases. The state of TOD in Cuyahoga County talks about the importance of TOD and identifies and quantifies corridors. The analysis of TOD zoning looks at existing zoning to see whether it allows TOD, and those are the first 2 phases that we're working on now. We'll head into the future towards model TOD zoning and TOD financing strategies. You can visit us for updates on the project at countyplanning.us/TOD, and for an interactive overview of the state of TOD, you can visit countyplanning.us/TOD overview. We are excited to announce that in the coming weeks, we'll be sending out our next document related to this project, Development Trends on TOD Corridors. This project and this document will outline exactly the type of development that has been occurring on TOD corridors, including quantifying things such as data by community and data by Cleveland neighborhood, so that you can see how much investment has occurred within your community or neighborhood. The TOD conversations have been happening Fridays at 12 via Zoom. Thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for participating. We heard from Shaker Heights, Minneapolis, and Cleveland Heights. Today, we will be hearing from Shannon Norman, Principal Planner for Ordinances and Code Revision with the City of Indianapolis's Department of Metropolitan Development. This is our last one scheduled for this year. The other video recordings are available. We will send this one out after. If you do have questions or follow-up, please feel free to reach out at phewitt@cuyahogacounty.us. And with that, Shannon, I will stop sharing and I'll encourage you to share and get underway. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And first and foremost, I would just like to say I have been so blessed to work with the folks from Cuyahoga County and really like diving into what this presentation could be like. And it's been really exciting for me. And I just like to say, thank you for the opportunity to let me talk about something that has been such a big part of what's going on in Indianapolis for the last couple of years. I would not suggest trying to pass a big zoning update like this during a pandemic, but if you have to, I can give you some tips. So my presentation today is titled TOD Zoning for Solutions. And the reason why I chose that title is because sometimes I think that zoning in the most comprehensive terms sets up a framework, it gives a regulatory backbone to policy, but a lot of times solving for X only occurs after those regulations are passed. But this was a situation through the American Cities Climate Challenge where we were given the go-ahead to establish a zoning solution for transit-oriented development, even before all of our BRT lines have been built out. So hopefully through this, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. And as Patrick said, I hope to leave a lot of time for Q&A, but make sure to raise your little hand and we will get started. Little about me, I am the principal planner for code revision and ordinances with the city of Indianapolis. Prior to that, I've been here about 5 years. Prior to that, I was the city planner and worked in the mayor's office for Greencastle, Indiana, a tiny town of 10,000 that is home to DePauw University. So understanding some of those town gown challenges and political strategy to that was my big job. So that's where I came from. So I hope that kind of sets the stage for what I'm doing now, which is a lot more specialized, of course. I want to start out with a little bit of level setting because this is what I always had to go back to during this process. First and foremost, transit-oriented development is not new, especially in Indianapolis. We have had a bus or a streetcar system for decades. But through establishing policy and regulations, we're putting a name to something that we all know when we see it. But furthering that by establishing it with some roots. For us, we looked at transit-oriented development as a bridge between community, economic, and neighborhood development. We know that we have some areas of tremendous development potential that just so happen to be along the rapid transit lines, but we also have recognized that there are communities that are going to thrive from transit being adjacent to the residential districts, and also some neighborhoods that have suffered from lack of transit or improper placement of transit. So we think that this particular set of policies and regulation help to bridge those gaps, and I hope that comes through in my presentation. Also, I think just from the standpoint of understanding why zoning is important in this case is that regulations have to support your policy. So I think, just judging from the participant group here, we have a good handle on the policies, both strategic, neighborhood, economic development that our cities have in place. But the regulations that currently exist in most places don't forward or progress those goals because they were not crafted at the time that those policies were first established, and that's okay. I would suggest that sometimes iterative zoning is not always conducive to change, right? We have been building these zoning solution sets for decades, but we haven't always done that with our eye on the future. It's been very reactive. So I just want to posit the fact that sometimes you might need to start from scratch, but more than likely, there is some transferability in what you already have. It's just tweaking that. For the city of Indianapolis, we only have one BRT line that's completely built out. We have a funded purple line and a blue line that is not completely funded yet. So we're actually sort of testing this out on our red line. But we've often told, especially our policymakers and city councilors, that really the TOD zoning solution works even without transit. Walkable neighborhoods are good. Mixed use development, great. These types of things support transit, but their two are not mutually exclusive. And the last point in my level setting talk is that always remember that R&D missions are not research and development, they're rob and duplicate. There were a lot of standards that we pulled from other cities who had tried in part to do TOD, or who were, solving for X in terms of light rail even. So none of this is meant to be like earth shattering. No one's ever done it. A lot of times it's just figuring out a way to make the zoning solution very specific to your situation. So here's the fun part. So let's talk a little bit about Indianapolis. Many of you know, I won't spend a lot of time on it. We're the capital city of Indiana, crossroads of America. We've got a lot of interstates and a lot of roads, period. So that creates some opportunities, but also has provided many a threat to neighborhood and community development. We're a consolidated city and a county. Indianapolis, our term for it is Unigov. It happened back in the 60s and has had mixed results. Some things have caused major equity landmines. There have been gaps in service, but it also forced private entities to work as municipal corporations, supporting work that couldn't necessarily be done by government. And Indigo, our public transportation system, is one of those muni corps. We have an estimated population of around 1 million in the city and county. Of course, most of those folks live in Indianapolis. I'm a lifelong resident, except for some travels for school and other things. And I live pretty close to downtown. So I actually live on the blue line. So this does affect me in a real principled manner as well. So as I said, we're a consolidated city and county, and we have a really unique planning jurisdiction. We have about 400 square miles, and we have everything from the very severe urban core that's nearly built out. We're seeing a lot of infill development, which is great, but it also provides certain challenges, as you all know. We do have a major suburban or metro area. And then of course, we have some family farms. So we're dealing with a lot. And so solving for X in our situation is tough, because in the parlance of zoning, a D5 downtown is not the same as a D5 out in the more metro areas. Fun fact, our jurisdiction is larger than New York City minus the waterways. So imagine larger than New York City with 1/8 of the population. It's unique, and it calls for a little bit more care when coming up with strategy. And I think that's why sometimes we're a good example to other folks, because sort of our petri dish of policy kind of spans a lot of user groups. So I hope that's helpful in terms of this presentation. So I thought this was interesting to mention, and this is definitely not a commercial, but I can't say enough about the group Urban 3. Joe Mincozy is an amazing presenter, and Urban 3 has been able to support Indianapolis by giving us a real detailed urban snapshot of what our TOD area is looking like, especially from an economic and value standpoint. And that's really been sort of some of the backbone of our presenting to policymakers and lawmakers in terms of what can be expected if we pass TOD policies and what are the consequences if we don't. So, and I'm not a map person. I am a map reader, not a map maker. So Urban 3 really worked hard on this. I said, but this was a very, very compelling set of data for us. And that is, how is the land in Marion County being consumed? And as I mentioned before, as you can see from this graph, we had a lot of roads. We're dealing with a tremendous amount of hardscape, and the amount of developable land that we have is premium. It's in getting more so, especially and if you notice to the center of this map, our downtown core, if it's not buildings or roads, it's parking. And that is something that as a department, the Department of Metro Development, we have to address, because the need for public parking it is there. And we know that is probably not going to change quickly, if at all. But how can we mitigate some of those things? So I would urge you, if you're able to do some sort of study of land consumption in your area, do that. Because I think it only furthers what we all know, and that is, if you take a really detailed look at where you're zoning for, you do have limits to what you can do. I mean, this is not just an open, green field. So I wanted to include that just as to keep in your mind about a potential data point that may be helpful in the future. So this is great. These are some of my favorite maps, and this data came from our county assessor's office. Again, Urban 3 was just really good at drilling down and talking to us about how to interpret it. So as I mentioned, we're the crossroads of America. Interstates 70, 65, and the 465 loop encompass Indianapolis proper, and then absolutely go out into the county. But when looking at the value of our land, you will see that downtown Indianapolis is where the value lies, and where that value lies also includes the area where the red and the blue line intersect each other, and then also we do have some very valuable property going out of town. And funny enough, if you see the area sort of, it would be to the north of the purple. This is where some of our most interesting TOD developments of the past were located. And I think it's interesting because, like I said, TOD is not new. Buses have always run out of downtown Indianapolis. My grandmother went to nursing school at Methodist Hospital downtown and took the bus back to Kokomo every Friday. So this is not something new. But value per acre is a really nice data point as well. And then we look at TOD. So zooming in on that high concentrated area of very valuable per acre land, zooming in on the areas where the red and the blue line go through, we can see that that's very valuable acreage. The stat that we like to talk about is that the BRT lines in Indianapolis constitute about 2% of our land area, but it's the most valuable real estate that we have. and letting that be taken over by parking lots and suburban development is a loss, a once in a generation loss, because once that land is gone, it's very hard to get back if you ever do. Okay, so moving on, I've done the data thing. Now we can get back to the social science thing where I tend to be more comfortable. So when we were talking about TOD, we had some partners, both with our MPO, with Indigo, who had been working on this for like 10 years, had been saying like, we have the potential to do something. We just don't know how to make it regulation. So many of the policies were built on this future construction. So when it came to setting goals, we knew that goal number one was always that we had to create development potential in the BRT corridors. We had to say that there are certain land use that are not contributing, most of them auto. I hate to say it, but it's true, you know. But we also wanted to set the goal that we knew that downtown is not just commerce, is not just public space, but it's also neighborhoods. And how would those neighborhoods be impacted by future transit, but also how many of those development patterns could we translate across the jurisdiction and make them make sense in other places? We knew to do this that we had to update our zoning code. It took on its first comprehensive update in 30 years in 2015. So we came like lightning speed in 2015, but these tweaks that we were making constitute sort of what I was talking about. And that sometimes means taking iterative zoning and saying, great, we've come this far, but now we need to move light years ahead in 2 years instead of 30. So we knew that corresponding with those transit investments, we had the kind of lightning strikes moment where now was the time to do that. And as I said, I think an overarching goal was to take sort of those non-contributing uses, parking lots, gas stations, car washes, and things like that, and to limit them, but not prohibit them. Because we knew that selling to our boards and commissions that you could never have a gas station along TOD wouldn't fly. People aren't there yet. But we knew, especially if we got a good set of design standards, that we could limit those uses through design and make it more of a public conversation if people wanted to do those non-contributing uses in the TOD overlay district. So, biggest thing, and this is what, I mean, I spent months and months and months talking to our legislators about this, and TOD really is an opportunity to create equity, right? We have been hit in the face with a lot of competing messages about how transit impacts neighborhoods. Does it cause gentrification? Does it, displace folks? And we knew we had to start from a place of explaining that mixes of housing types, connections to transit, neighborhood connectivity, accessibility for all kinds of folks, these things are opportunities to create equity. And we also focused a lot on this idea that we're not saying no cars, but we're saying like cars can be optional, right? Like you don't have to drive everywhere. You can link trips, and you don't have to take transit everywhere. You can link trips. And so this was a narrative that played over and over again. And surprisingly, it was not that hard to convince most people that there were populations that not only were completely ignored by zoning, but also it sort of reinforced these stereotypes that, all seniors drive, all kids get driven by their parents, kids ride the bus. It's really meaningful to me. Every day I drive past a couple of transit stops and there are young kids using the bus to get to school. I mean, this is a reality. So talking about equity ultimately led to a really great discussion about our development districts. We have 14 dwelling districts in Indianapolis. And in looking at the dwelling districts, we realized that some of the existing development patterns that we have are not supported by our current ordinance. Some of those downtown neighborhoods that people love, you couldn't build today. And so we knew that we had to take an overall approach to upping the game when it came to those. So we talked a lot about missing middle housing. The fact that some of our oldest neighborhoods downtown are not allowed to have ADUs now sort of put everybody on the spot saying, why? What's changed? And the answer is, iterative zoning was left behind when we started talking about, what people wanted in their neighborhood. That shift occurred, and it became less of a priority. But now with infill development, it's become more of a conversation, a positive one. So again, we talked about the car optional thing a lot during the missing middle housing discussion, and all of these car optional benefits or goals are important, but I've highlighted a few. And I think that what I would say about these are that we start to talk about creating neighborhood developments, mixed use, enabling some of these things, but it all kind of the great convergence of everything, and I get caught up on this because I want to choose my words wisely, is the great convergence of these things is sometimes density doesn't mean adding more people. It means adding more building types or allowing more things by right, instead of having to go to the board for approval and sort of doing this piecemeal. Let's do it all at once. Let's make mixed use part of neighborhood development and infill development, which was incredibly important to us, as during the TOD passage, we were also passing infill housing guidelines. So we talked a lot about car optional, and I would say when you get a copy of this presentation, take a look at these objectives and sort of think in your mind how you can start to prioritize some of these things. So our specific approach to this came out very quickly, and that is that we wanted to switch from reactive sort of zoning solutions to more proactive ones. We also wanted them to be effective, of course, right? Why do this if it's not going to have an impact? But we also knew that since we had only passed Indy rezone or our comprehensive zoning ordinance 5 years prior to this, we didn't want to throw all that work out. Like I said, we came light years in 2015. So our approach was to do some strategic text amendments, sort of, right size our development standards, but also to create a very specific geographically anchored overlay district. I don't know that this would work everywhere, but it certainly was our solution. So let's talk a little bit more. So strategic amendments, I mean, like I said, we wanted to really take the ordinance for a walk and see what would happen if we took the existing regulations, but we added in sort of these principles of, design objectives for walkable neighborhoods, for mixed use, but also looking at what it meant to look at a form-based code, which we have never delved into. Indiana largely doesn't do form-based codes, not for any reason other than that's, not how we've always done it. And I know that my planner friends can attest to that being a sentiment that we hear a lot. So I started calling it a semi form-based code because we couldn't go all the way there, but we definitely have some elements of form-based code. So it was about creating potential, but also elevating our projects and requiring good design. I don't think, just to be a little critical, I don't think that we've required good design. We've asked for it, but we didn't make it a priority. That's not to say that everything in the overlay is going to be, a historic preservation district level design manual, but there are some key strategies, as I've mentioned, that we thought were important. So this is just a page of what we did. We actually got very surgical. We looked at sections of the development standards and we added them. We revamped our sidewalk and landscaping standards, specifically in dwelling and mixed use districts. And then we further refined what those mixed districts would look like and their applicability. And this would be a countywide ordinance. So we weren't just saying this is in TOD, this was for everything. Which at first was a hard sell, because when you're trying to say, let's create an overlay district, but you're also saying, but we're also going to elevate other districts too. We had some people get sort of itchy, and that was understandable. But then I think we quickly went back to, hey, walkable neighborhoods are not just for downtown. Walkable neighborhoods are for suburban subdivisions as well. And as I said, one of our biggest goals was to take the mixed use districts and make sure that they were actually usable. We found that there were some weird things, like heights were off. We kept getting variances for the height limitations in the lower MU districts, but the larger districts were largely unusable because no one could meet the minimum acreage. So we just had to retool those with purpose. And I think, keep your fingers crossed, we've seen some good projects come out of that. We haven't eliminated variances, right? Like, we still have people that want to do 8-story developments outside of these sort of core transit areas, and sometimes variances are necessary, but that's a means to an end, right? Especially if you're getting quality projects that are TOD friendly. And again, this was countywide. So just to sort of talk about the level of detail that we're working with, we really knew that building typology was important, and this is where sort of the form-based idea comes in. We had to really look at how, especially for existing zoning, how those lot widths were meeting out, and we found out that a lot of the older areas of town, even outside of the real urban core, were suffering from not allowing duplexes, but allowing sort of for small apartments. And we had to just really right size that to say, what is the context of this neighborhood? And this was a really great study, because I mean, it tested me as a planner, because I, fell in that category. Well, it's farther away from town, so it's less dense. And, people said, maybe not. I mean, maybe there are areas of town that deserve an amount of density because they have mixed use or commercial opportunities. So this was a real test of sort of my planner personality and my colleagues as well. So again, this is just sort of the detail that we got into. And I would invite anyone to check out our zoning ordinance online if you have more questions. Then we talked about the overlay districts. So we decided that we wanted to do a geographical approach. So actually targeting the land within those transit emphasis corridors, and saying that within 1,000 feet of center line, that's where the overlay would lie. We have some exceptions, we have some exemptions, but by and large, we knew that it wasn't just the first property adjacent to the line, but it could potentially be the neighborhood sort of behind that. So this has been interesting. We had some legislators that said, oh, that's way too big, you're going to stop development. And our answer to them was, well, maybe we'll encourage better development and people not assuming that the residential creep or the commercial creep into residential was just something we should all accept. How does our overlay work? We have some really strong design objectives. We do have the use limitations that I discussed, but also as far as development standards, like we wanted buildings closer to the street. We wanted the public realm or sidewalk to be part of a decision to site a building. And we wanted to put that on paper. And again, it all goes back to, does regulation support policy? So we have some examples. And again, I don't know how many folks have been to Indy, but when we start talking about our downtown area, we have some snapshots of that. And then we also have places like the Monon Trail that run right through a TOD area. And so again, we're seeing live action, increased connectivity and increased mixed use development. And that's on the ground now. And we can tout that, I think, as a success. I'm going to go with that. So another slide about value per acre, and this is something that we will always monitor. Some examples of some really nice dense development and mixed use development, and just how much those areas are commanding per acre versus the bottom right corner, which is like your suburban Walmart. I mean, it's undeniable that we are able to get more bang for our buck in TOD areas than just allowing big box retail and parking. And then this is just a nice graphic. If you want to sort of reuse it, I wouldn't be opposed to that. But talking to people about how density affects revenue by your building type. Again, this is not to say that all areas should be X, Y, or Z, but it's just, frankly, to me, a signal that we need to continue to sort of move away from thinking that, you know, parking as a primary land use is okay. Because, you know, in my opinion, it's not getting us anywhere, right? And I think that's important. We did a lot of stakeholder engagement. We reached out a lot. We chose participants very purposefully. I love that folks want to send people to the table who they think are their best and brightest, but we also need decision makers. I need the executive director of an organization to write a letter saying that TOD is righteous, right? Like, I think you want to get the right people at the table. I can't say enough how important it is to do working drafts, like let people see how a draft is evolving. That gained us a lot of political capital because people could see that their ideas were not being forgotten. Even though we were in the pandemic, we were doing all of our work remotely. It wasn't Shannon Norman writing the ordinance, it was stakeholders. And then again, I can't say enough that a data-driven process is good, but you also need to explain it. I don't know that I do a tremendous job at explaining the economics of value per acre, but I can show you the areas that I'm talking about and demonstrate a particular idea. And I think that served us very well. I included in this because you'll all get a copy of the presentation. We did a lot of these fact sheets just to remind people of the direction or the vector that we were heading, but also and our team says it's a way to dispel rumors, because we would get some crazy stuff like, we're going to make the whole city a TOD overlay. And it's like, well, no, we're not, but we'll answer it because it's important to you. So you can have this, and again, R&D mission, rob and duplicate, whatever you need. And we also were constantly partnering with Indigo and the MPO on producing maps that would demonstrate to people sort of the areas we were talking about. And, you know, breaking things down by transit stop was incredibly important because, like, you know, we have regulations where, for example, if you were in the TOD overlay, you would have to have 600 feet of separation between a transit station and X use. And so people could actually use this along with our mapping tools to sort of approximate where they were. You'll notice on here that we do have some of our local route information, and we would have loved to include the frequent grid in this, but we're just not there yet. The geographical approach, the corridor approach was where we landed, and who knows, it could get better and we could do something else, but for right now it does not cover our frequent grid. So I will stop talking now because I've laid a lot on you, and I'd really like to talk a bit more with you about some of the stuff and maybe how I can help you in your process. So I'm going to stop and let it sort of open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Shannon.